Hello and welcome back to the Stronghold. I'm the Magi, and today we are going to be talking about the all-important budget tier list. And no, this is not a pitch for you to pledge on my Patreon. In fact, it's kind of the exact opposite. Although I do distribute my spreadsheet through my Patreon page, it is not behind a paywall because I know all Magic players somewhere in their little Timmy hearts love to build decks. And I think it's very important to have good information so that you can take your resources for Arena and apply them in the best way possible. And while I do believe my Patreon is just chock full of value, I don't want to put something like this behind a paywall. It is absolutely available to even the free level members. So be sure to check that out. So I'm always working on improving these free resources for the community, and some recent changes would be the inclusion of more non-standard decks because of course Alchemy is a thing, the Eternal formats are a thing, and Brawl and Standard Brawl, all things, and depending upon how you spend your primary time, whether it's standard or not, it's always good to have a secondary outlet because, you know, standard gets stale sometimes. Other recent updates include hyperlinks from the decks directly to the content, talking about it, or deck lists. And I have most recently added my thoughts on the spreadsheet regarding the upcoming fall rotation. Yes, I know it's 6 months away, but it's never too early to have that in mind when you're talking about putting your resources into a deck list. I've also included my thoughts on what I think is going to be included as archetypes for the next iteration of starter decks. So maybe you don't want to put your resources into a deck that you might end up getting for free anyway, as well as what I think decks might be missing, etc., etc. All out there 100% for free. Perhaps even more importantly, there are some things that you are not going to see around here. One of which is I don't do zero rare decks. Aside from Pauper and Artisan, there really is no honor or benefit in building a deck with zero rares just so you can splash it into a title or thumbnail. Everyone starts with somewhere like 60 to 90 playable rares on day one, and ignoring those resources, in my opinion, is just as bad as spending your wildcards all willy-nilly on somebody's deck of the day. So we don't do that here. Similarly, there is no magic number of acceptable wildcards. I see 5 thrown around by a lot of folks. I'm not going to show you a deck that only has 5 wildcards if it needs 8 or 10 or whatever. I show you decks that are solid starting points for interesting, budget-friendly decks. I help you decide how to spend your resources and then let you make the decisions. But before we get into all that, take just a moment to like, comment, and subscribe because that kind of thing really keeps this boat moving. Now, what were we talking about? Oh yeah, right. There are a number of factors that I consider when I'm evaluating these decks. Of course, first and foremost is how playable is the deck, because if it's not going to help you grind out those daily wins, it's probably not an ideal candidate. Secondly, how much support does this deck get from things like your starter decks, your jump-in resources, and just following the plan? Next up, a deck needs to be timely, whether that is about those resources and how likely you are to continue collecting those resources, or is the deck due for a ban, or maybe it's coming up on its rotation. And of course, formats play a factor as well. If a deck is likely to do something in a non-standard format, whether that is Alchemy, Eternal formats, or one of the brawl bases, it's good to have flexible deck concepts. One thing you'll notice that isn't here is how fun a deck is, because fun is a very subjective thing, and I'm not here to tell you the quote-unquote right way to have fun. You're going to need to figure that out for yourself. When I'm doing evaluations, I like to use what I lovingly refer to as the Eastwood Ratings system, breaking your choices down into 3 easy categories: the good, the bad, and the ugly. Good decks are just that. These are what represent your best daily grinder decks, and the best places for you to invest your resources to get the optimal result to effort ratios. These decks tend to be a full standard deviation mathematically above the moving average of all the decks that we're looking at. Bad decks, on the other hand, tend to be a little more tongue-in-cheek as far as the naming convention. These decks are, in fact, centered around that moving average of all the other decks. And despite what the name might imply, these decks are still perfectly playable. I just wouldn't necessarily recommend putting a lot of resources into these decks because they're just not as well positioned as the good right now. But of course, as card pools and metas change, these could very easily shift up or down the spectrum. And finally, ugly decks are sadly just that. Although these might have been in-season darlings, they just didn't pan out the way they wanted to, and it's not really worth investing resources into these decks. But if you already have them and enjoy them, there's really no harm in playing these existing decks. They just don't seem to have a pathway to move out of this particular category, although from time to time, you might see one of these move up. All right, so I really want to start the deck-specific portions of existing decks, that is, with mono blue control. And the first thing I want to say is this deck is different than the mono blue tempo you see a lot of people talking about in the metaverse out there for standard. And it is placed differently within the meta because of that. One of the cards that I've got in here that isn't currently in the list, but is kind of a focal point to the conversation, is Cavern of Souls. A lot of people want to act like mono blue is dead because of the existence of Cavern of Souls. Because, oh no, we can't counter their creatures. And while that's very true for the contemporary meta tempo version of the deck, where countering creatures is a huge part, it's not really a huge part of this deck. In fact, we only run 2 creature-specific counters, that being either Assimilated Essence or Essence Scatter, a total of 2 depending upon how your collection looks. So countering those creature spells is really not what it's all about. Instead, we're trying to play key creatures like the newly added this year Chromho Seed Shark, that's from your new player experience and also available to you from Jump In. Of course, the ubiquitous Hadi Jin up in there, still going really strong. Although if Wizards does like they did last year with the summer standard bans, this boy is certainly going to be a hot part of that conversation. But hey, even if you've spent wildcards on it, you get the wildcards back if they ban it. So don't be too fretful on that. Don't shy away from the deck because of that. I don't think it's a good strategic move. And of course, the ubiquitous Tolarian Terror that will be part of the deck next year if the deck continues to exist. So I don't really think the inability to counter creatures brought in with Cavern of Souls is necessarily hurting the deck. We're all about playing these 3 creatures and then using hard counters for non-creature spells to protect them and win the game. And of course, meanwhile, we're using things like Fading Hope. You know what? I couldn't counter your creature, but I can wait till you move to attack and bounce the boy right back to your hand. And for those that don't have Fading Hope, Rona's Vortex does a passable substitution for it. You really only want to be running 2. You might go up to 3 on something like that, maybe dropping the Spell Pierce. That's a strategic question. Consider Hope, of course, is our other big 1 drop to allow us to draw and start putting things into the graveyard right away. As far as new cards here, Eldritch Memory can be a potential thing to test here, just because we draw so many cards. Although we usually draw cards at the end of our opponent's turn, this might be a reason for a strategic change to start pumping up our few creatures. But then again, if you don't have a creature on the field for some reason, it's a little less good. Steamcore Scholar is another card here. If Hadijin does get banned in that Summer Standard ban sweep, this is a potential replacement consideration. I'm not sure it does the job, but it does draw us an awful lot of cards, so it's something to definitely keep in mind. Intrude into the Mind is just a hyper-efficient way of drawing cards and creating creatures. I'm not sure if a 5-drop is really where we want to be in this deck. We do have Flow of Knowledge already, but maybe for folks that don't have Flow of Knowledge, this might be a potential replacement. Certainly worth testing. Would allow us to maybe go some different directions with our mana base. Certainly worth considering and exploring. And last up on my short list from Murders is Lost in the Maze. As I pointed out, we only run 2.5 slots of creatures, so getting in for that combat damage is pretty significant. And holding back opponents' early threats by being able to tap them down, put stun counters on it, things like that, all really good things. Unfortunately, pretty much all of these are rares, so it makes the deck a little less budget, but it's certainly worth considerations here.
Woo! Now that I've got that off my chest, let's flip the script and talk about some of the ugly decks. And let's face it, we are in the 3rd portion of the standard season for the year, so there's a lot of decks in the ugly category. And I certainly encourage you to peruse those and make your own decisions about them. But there's 3 in particular that got downgraded for the season. The first up, no surprise, is the Simic Scrymia River starter deck. Not only is this thing not playable outside of Alchemy, it just really has no path to exit from its ugly status. And please don't put resources into this unless Alchemy is your primary jam, in which case you have probably already done this. Next up, we've got 2 Wilds of Eldraine decks. The Golgari food-based cheap snack deck just has not panned out. Food is not looking to be on the upswing for the remainder of this year. We've gotten some preview leak action at this point going on for the Outlaws set, and it doesn't look like this deck is going to get any better, and there are certainly better Golgari options, which we will talk about later. Lastly, the Wilds of Eldraine Is It Bad Apprenticeship Spells Matter deck. Again, the last 2 Is It decks have been more Artifact Matters archetypes, and although we have good indications that Outlaws is going to go back to the Spell Matters, there's not a lot of hope that Wizards is suddenly going to make this a good archetype. It very classically is hard to balance, so I would not put a lot of eggs in that particular basket. All right, on the other end at the good spectrum, beyond mono blue control, which I had to get off my chest a little bit early, the mono white or blue white soldiers / humans continues to be a very good deck. It is supported very strongly by your starters and jump in as well. If you haven't already invested in this deck, I think it's well worth doing. It's got another year in standard. And Boros, which we will talk about a little bit later on, continues to add versatility to a lot of these cards. Beyond that, mono red is almost always a good budget-friendly deck. Right now it's running about a 57% win rate. It's pretty well supported with your starters, as well as a number of singles from following the plan during Wilds of Eldraine, but not a lot since then at lower rarities. Galisa Sunslayer tends to be the most budget-friendly brawl option, and in fact, you can build that 100% just from your starter collection and just upgrade it from there. We've also got mono white lifegain for alchemy and bridging into historic. Really good, solid options there that are extremely budget accessible. Gruul Stompy it looks like a budget deck when you're looking at the LCI season, but the reality is this deck is a lot greedier than I wanted it to be. You really need like 10 plus non-land rares in this to function with any kind of consistency and high level win rates like you want. Maybe not the best place to put resources like wildcards, but depending upon how like your jump-in choices and your pack openings went, this is a very solid deck that you might just luck into. New for this season, of course, Insidious Roots is all over the place. This one builds very nicely off the starter deck, Savage Scavengers from Golgari. And of course, the Murders at Karlov Manor added so much to this Graveyard Matters archetype. This deck is so good. I've got a extensive, fully comprehensive deck tech coming out tomorrow. So be on the lookout for that. And of course, I've talked several times about, is it artifacts / pirates really going up this year? And I think this deck is going to get more and more solid. I'm not sure how much Outlaws is going to add to it, but I think this is a real budget contender to keep our eye on. And I'm hoping it is the 2025 Is It starter deck, although I'm not sure. Wizards of the Coast tends to go back towards that Spells Matter archetype, so I am prepared to be disappointed on that front. And as we move towards wrapping things up with the bad, first, let me say, I think this is where the green-based Slime Against Humanity decks will generally fall, but I didn't include it in the graphic because I think the deck will actually be better next year post-rotation, but of course that remains to be seen. Starting at the top, we've spoken several times already this season about how accessible and budget-friendly the Rakdos Aggro segments can be. A bit further down the list, we actually see the Wilds of Eldraine based Rats deck in there as well. Right now I'm separating those, but I think ultimately they kind of hybridize and become the same deck. The thing that's keeping them separate right now is my own curiosity as to what they do with the Rakdos starter deck for next year. But we'll see how that moves forward. Below that is a bit of a surprise. The Simic Explore decks are doing surprisingly well. I'm just not sure how well that's going to hold up. We'll have to see. Boros Tokens is next up on the list and a very solid contender. It's not extremely budget friendly in its meta version, but a lot of those rare / mythic cards can function pretty well within the deck, even as just one or two ofs. So that is something I plan on exploring this season. Of course, we have Legions of Phyrexia, the white-black starter deck, just with some slight tweaks for the alchemy play, small investments there. Mono Red Rush is actually a deck that I hope to be able to highlight this season, or it might be a Gruul alchemy build all around very hasty creatures. Below that, we've got the Be My +1, the white-green +1/+1 counters, Matter deck. Really what's holding this back is the absolute proliferation of available cards in both LCI and more recently Murders. I think it's just having a hard time kind of gelling and figuring out what the correct list is here. Not to mention that this kind of overlaps with enchantments and the green-white artifacts deck. It's just having a hard time finding a voice, but I think once we get there, that deck is going to be very, very good and certainly playable as time goes on. Just below that, we've got the Dimir Alchemy Toxic deck, super budget friendly, despite the fact that those cards are getting a little bit aged. The fact that you don't need a single rare in that deck makes it very budget friendly. Disguise has been a little underwhelming, the Gruul mechanic from Murders. I'm hoping that it finds a voice. Maybe it finds a place in Extended where it can tap into some similar archetypes, but we'll have to see how that plays out. Mono White Artifacts is still in contention. And might actually be a stronger deck next year post-rotation. We touched on white-green artifacts. That gets still a lot of strong jump-in support. And Wilds of Eldraine, LCI, all of those sets doing things for it. Again, just like the +1/+1 counters, it's kind of having a hard time finding a best list. And this one might not ever get there. The key cards might rotate out before this ever really comes together, just because there's so many more solid options at the moment. And speaking of artifacts, mono red artifacts based in Kamigawa, still a force to be reckoned with. It is getting closer to rotation, so if you haven't already built this deck or invested in those key cards, I'm not sure now is the right time to do it. But of course, if you have already done it, this deck is still pushing win rates of nearly 60% with no need for rares whatsoever. And of course, Matt would not want you to forget the links to the spreadsheet that I'm referencing is in the doobly-doo down below, i.e. the description for those of you who never seen Matt's channel. And also don't forget to save a copy of that in case you want to make changes of your own. And I will continue to update the spreadsheet with things like new win rates, additional thoughts, adjustments to scoring, etc. as this year goes on. So make sure to check in from time to time because information does change. And before we go, I want to take just a moment to thank my totally awesome patrons for supporting me and allowing me to apply my passion into a community. And of course, before we go, I've got some suggestions for your next step.